The man they called a servant arrived at Stonefield Manor on a gray morning, when the frost still clung to the iron gate, and the horses in the stable breathed clouds into the cold air. He wore a rough wool tunic the color of mud, a patched cloak over his broad shoulders, and boots that had seen better roads. No one looked at him twice. That was exactly what he had intended. His name, for the purposes of that morning, was Cole. Theron had chosen the name himself, 3 days ago, when he had told his council he was riding north to inspect the border territories. He had not told them about Stonefield. He had not told them about the girl. He had simply taken a horse, left his crown locked in its cedar box, and ridden for 2 days through pine forest and frozen creek beds, until the gray towers of the manor appeared on the horizon like a bad memory. He needed to see her before the contract was signed. That was the reason he gave himself, at least. The steward at the gate had believed him without question. A servant sent ahead by Lord Vane's household, he had said, carrying correspondence and needing a warm place to wait. The steward, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, had pointed him toward the kitchen courtyard and told him to stay out of the way of the morning preparations. Theron had thanked him with the quiet, slightly lowered gaze he had practiced in the mirror of a roadside inn, the expression of a man who expected nothing and deserved less. Now he stood near the woodpile at the edge of the courtyard, stacking logs he did not need to stack, watching the back door of the manor house. The courtyard itself was modest, hemmed in on 3 sides by stone walls darkened with age and moss. A rope line ran between 2 iron posts near the basin. Clay pots were stacked unevenly near the kitchen door. The smell of wood smoke and boiled grain drifted from inside, mixing with the sharper smell of frost and wet stone. It was the smell of a working house, not a wealthy one, despite the towers and the iron gate. Theron noticed the cracked mortar between the stones, the shutter on the upper window hanging from a single hinge, the way the steward's coat had been mended so many times at the collar that the original fabric was barely visible. Stonefield had the bones of a proud estate and the breath of a house slowly running out of time. He had been watching for 20 minutes when she appeared. Ellie came through the door carrying a basket of wet linen, her dark hair loose and tangled from sleep, her feet in worn leather slippers that were completely wrong for the weather. She wore a plain gray dress under an old wool shawl that had unraveled at one corner and dragged along the ground behind her. She was not what he had expected. The portrait sent to his court 3 months ago had shown a composed young woman in a blue gown with her hair arranged in careful coils, her expression serene and practiced, her hands folded in her lap like a woman who had been told exactly how to sit. This woman moved like someone who had forgotten she was being watched. She dropped the basket near the stone basin, pushed her hair out of her face with the back of her wrist, and began pulling the wet linens out one by one, shaking them hard before hanging them on the rope line. Her breath came in small white puffs in the cold air. She worked fast, with the efficiency of someone who had done this task many times and found no particular joy in it, but no complaint in it either. There was something in the set of her shoulders, straight but not stiff, that suggested she was somewhere else entirely inside her own head, while her hands moved through the familiar motions. Theron kept stacking logs. She did not notice him. There were 3 other servants in the courtyard, a boy carrying firewood, an older woman grinding grain in a stone mortar near the kitchen wall, and a man repairing a wheel near the gate. Theron was simply another body in the gray morning, unremarkable, invisible. He had learned long ago that invisibility was not about disguise. It was about expectation. People saw what they were already looking for. He watched her hang the last of the linens. Then the door behind her opened again, and 2 women stepped out. They were dressed better than Ellie, in clean wool dresses with embroidered hems, their hair neatly pinned under linen caps. He recognized the type immediately. Not servants, not true nobility either. The comfortable, dangerous middle ground of distant relatives who lived in a house that was not theirs and never let anyone forget which parts of it belonged to them. The taller one spoke first. Her voice carried across the courtyard without effort, shaped by years of never lowering it. You left the good basin cloth inside again. I told you yesterday the white linens go first. Ellie did not turn around. I'll get them in the next round. The next round. The woman repeated the words with a particular kind of patience that was not patience at all. The Alpha King's representatives arrive in 4 days, Ellie. 4 days. And you cannot manage a simple order of linen. I managed all of this. Ellie gestured at the full line without looking up. Those are household rags. The second woman, shorter and rounder, clicked her tongue against her teeth. Honestly, cousin, I've said it to Mother a dozen times. I don't understand why Uncle even put your name forward for this arrangement. You don't know how to present yourself in company. You don't speak with any kind of refinement. And you spend half your mornings doing the work of the kitchen girls as though you have nothing better to occupy yourself with. Ellie turned then. Her face was still, in a way that Theron recognized immediately as the practiced stillness of someone holding something much larger underneath it. He had worn that expression himself, in council chambers and throne rooms, when men twice his age had said things designed to diminish him. Aunt Vera asked me to help this morning, Ellie said quietly, because 2 of the kitchen girls are unwell. I was being useful. You were hiding, the tall one said flatly. You always hide when there's something uncomfortable to face. This contract is not going to disappear because you bury yourself in other people's laundry. She paused, letting her gaze move over Ellie slowly, the kind of assessment that was meant to be felt. You should pray the Alpha King's men see something worth the alliance when they arrive, because from where I stand, your uncle is offering them very little. And you, least of all. The shorter one laughed, a quick bright sound she covered with her hand but did not entirely conceal. Ellie said nothing. The 2 women turned and went back inside. The door closed with a dull wooden sound that somehow carried more weight than a slam would have. For a moment, the courtyard was still. Just the grinding stone, the boys' boots on the cobble, the faint creak of the rope line swaying in the wind. The older woman near the kitchen wall kept her eyes down, focused on her mortar, in the practiced way of someone who had learned that witnessing such moments was its own kind of danger. Ellie stood with her back to the closed door, her head slightly bowed. Her fingers were moving against the rim of the basket, working at a loose piece of wicker without seeming to know they were doing it. Her slippers were damp from the wet stones. There was a small red mark on her left wrist, where the basket handle had dug in. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. But something in the line of her back, the particular quality of her stillness, made Theron set down the log in his hand very carefully. The way a man sets something down when he is afraid of what he might do if his hands are not deliberately occupied. Then she looked up, directly at him. He held her gaze without thinking, a half-second too long for a servant, too steady for a man who had nothing to hide. He saw the uncertainty move through her eyes, quick and instinctive, the flicker of someone registering that a thing was not quite what it appeared to be, without yet knowing why. He looked down at the logs. He heard her footsteps cross the courtyard, slow and even, and stop a few feet away. I don't know you, she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected. Quiet, but not soft in the way of timidity. Careful. The voice of someone who had learned to spend words deliberately. Cole, he said, without looking up. Sent from Lord Vane's household. Waiting on correspondence. A pause. Lord Vane's household is 2 days south, she said. You must have ridden through the night. Part of the way. Another silence. Longer. He could feel her attention on him, the same quality of focus she had brought to the laundry line, unhurried and complete. There's porridge left from breakfast, she said at last. The kitchen door's unlocked. Help yourself before it goes cold. He looked up because he could not stop himself. She was already walking away, basket under her arm, the loose corner of her shawl trailing across the frost-gray stones behind her. She did not look back. She moved like a woman who had offered the only small kindness available to her and expected nothing in return for it. Theron stood in the cold morning air with a log in each hand and felt something shift in his chest that he did not yet have a name for. He had come to Stonefield to observe, to assess, to make a rational decision about a political contract before committing the weight of his name and his kingdom to it. He had come as a stranger in borrowed clothes to look at a woman he had never met, in a house he had never visited, with the cold efficiency of a king who had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury his position could not afford. He had not come to be offered porridge by a woman with frost-damp slippers and white knuckles, who did not flinch and did not break, and did not ask anything of anyone. He set the logs down. Inside the manor, somewhere beyond the gray stone walls and the frost-laced windows, a door opened and closed in the south corridor. A man sat down at a writing desk. A candle threw its small light across parchment and a moving hand. The letter that man was writing was not addressed to the AlphaKing. It was addressed to someone who had been waiting a very long time for news from Stonefield. And it began. She does not suspect anything. We are still on course. Ellie had learned early in life that the safest place in any house was the one nobody thought to look. In Stonefield Manor, that place was the old library on the second floor, a narrow room at the end of the east corridor that smelled of dust and dried leather, and the faint sweetness of wood slowly aging. The shelves were only half full. Many of the books had been sold years ago, during the first of her uncle's bad harvests, and the gaps they had left behind were filled now with stacked papers, a broken clock that no one had repaired, and 3 ceramic jars whose purpose Ellie had never determined. The room had one window that faced north, which meant it was cold in winter and dim in summer, which meant nobody wanted it, which meant it was hers. She sat in the chair by the window that afternoon with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. Outside, the frost had softened into a thin gray drizzle, and the pine trees at the edge of the manor grounds stood dark and still in the wet air. The smell of rain on old stone drifted through the gap at the bottom of the window frame, mixing with the leather and dust of the room. She was thinking about the servant in the courtyard. Cole, he had said, from Lord Vane's household. She had believed him. There was no reason not to. Men passed through Stonefield regularly in the weeks before an important arrangement. Messengers and stewards and advance riders checking accommodations, confirming schedules, carrying the invisible machinery of negotiation from one estate to another. She had grown up watching them come and go, these men who arrived with sealed letters and left without meeting her eyes. But this one had met her eyes. That was the thing she could not place. Not the length of it, though that had been unusual. It was the quality of it, the steadiness. Most men who worked for noble houses had learned a particular kind of gaze, slightly downward, slightly averted, the careful non-look of someone trained to be present without being perceived. This man had looked at her the way people looked at things they were genuinely trying to understand. She turned a page she had not read. The drizzle thickened against the window. She told herself it did not matter. In 4 days, the AlphaKing's official representatives would arrive at Stonefield, and whatever they saw or did not see would determine the shape of the rest of her life. That was the thing she should be thinking about, not a servant with steady eyes and borrowed boots. The contract had been explained to her 6 weeks ago in her uncle's study, with the fire going and a cup of cold tea at her elbow. Her uncle, Lord Cedric of Stonefield, was a careful man, precise in his speech and uncomfortable with emotion, the kind of man who delivered difficult news in the same tone he used to discuss weather. He had told her that negotiations with the Northern Territories had reached a point where a formal alliance was the only practical path forward. He had told her that the AlphaKing had agreed in principle to a marriage arrangement. He had told her that her name had been put forward because she was the most suitable candidate available. He had not asked her what she thought. She had not told him. What would she have said if he had asked? That she was afraid? Yes. That the thought of leaving Stonefield, this cold and crumbling house she had grown up in, filled her with a loneliness that surprised her with its intensity. because she had never been particularly happy here. That she knew nothing about the Alpha King except that he was powerful and remote, and that men spoke his name with a particular combination of respect and caution that told her more than any official report. That she was 23 years old and had spent most of those years trying to take up as little space as possible, and she was not sure she knew how to be looked at directly, let alone be the wife of a king. She closed the book. Downstairs, she could hear her cousins in the main hall, their voices carrying up through the floor in a bright and indistinct murmur. They were happy, she knew, not because they wished her well, but because her departure would rearrange things in their favor. Her uncle's house, his attention, his remaining resources, all of it would settle more firmly in their direction once she was gone. She had understood this for a long time without letting herself feel it fully. Today, in the courtyard, she had felt it. She stood, moved to the window, and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. In the courtyard below, the rope line was empty now. The linens had been taken in. The woodpile was neatly stacked on the left side of the wall. She frowned slightly. She had stacked the wood on the right side this morning. She always stacked it on the right side, close to the kitchen door, so it was easy to carry inside. Someone had moved it. Theron spent the afternoon learning the house. This was habit more than strategy. The same instinct that had kept him alive through 12 years of ruling a kingdom, where not everyone had wanted him to succeed. He moved through the spaces available to him: the kitchen, the stable yard, the woodshed, the storage rooms off the east corridor. And he catalogued what he saw with the quiet precision of a man who had learned that understanding a place meant understanding its vulnerabilities. Stonefield was not a happy house. He had sensed it from the gate, confirmed it in the courtyard, and felt it more clearly now as the afternoon settled into early evening and the lamps were lit one by one in the windows. There was a particular quality to the silence of a house under strain, a tightness in the way people moved, a carefulness in the way they spoke, as though everyone had agreed without discussion to avoid certain rooms, certain subjects, certain names. He had spoken to 4 servants by the time supper was being laid. A stable boy named Pell, barely 15, who told him more than he realized in the process of saying very little. An older cook named Marta, who had looked at him once with sharp gray eyes, and then decided, apparently, that he was not worth her suspicion, which meant she talked freely while she worked. A groundsman who said almost nothing but whose expression, when Lord Cedric's name came up in passing, was the expression of a man who had stopped expecting things to improve. What he had gathered, piece by piece, was this: Lord Cedric had debts, significant ones, accumulated over a decade of bad decisions and worse luck, and now pressing close enough to be felt in the thinness of the household staff, the state of the grounds, the sold-off books. The alliance with the Northern Territories was not simply politically desirable, it was financially necessary. Without it, Stonefield would not survive another 2 years. Ellie did not know the full extent of this. He was almost certain of it, from the way Marta had mentioned her, with the particular protective vagueness people used around those they were trying to shield from something. She thought this was about politics. She did not know she was the price of her uncle's survival. Theron stood in the doorway of the woodshed as the drizzle came down in the gray early evening, and turned this over in his mind with the careful deliberateness of a man who was trying to decide how angry he was permitted to be. He had been offered women before, in the political sense of the word. It was the oldest mechanism of alliance-making, and he was not naive about it. He had expected something transactional. He had prepared himself for someone presented and positioned and managed like a piece in a game she had not chosen to play. He had not expected someone who got up before dawn to help sick kitchen girls with laundry and offered porridge to strangers without asking anything in return. He heard footsteps on the stone path behind him and turned. It was the man from the south corridor. Theron had noticed him earlier, in passing, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 40, well-dressed for a household steward, with a close-trimmed beard and pale eyes that moved too quickly for a man with nothing to hide. He had introduced himself as Prentice, Lord Cedric's personal secretary. He had smiled at Theron with the smooth, practiced warmth of someone who had learned that smiling was its own kind of armor. "Settling in?" Prentice asked, stopping a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. "Well enough," Theron said. Prentice looked at the woodpile. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and assessing. "Lord Vane's man, they told me. Waiting on papers." "That's right. Long ride for papers. Lord Vane is thorough." A pause. The drizzle hissed softly on the stone around them. Prentice smiled again, the same smile, precise and unmoved. "Well, supper's in the main kitchen for the household staff. You're welcome to it." He turned and walked back toward the manor without waiting for a response. Theron watched him go. The letter. The one being written that morning in the south corridor. She does not suspect anything. We are still on course. He needed to know who it was addressed to. He needed to know what exactly was on course, because the cold feeling settling in his chest as he watched Prentice disappear through the manor door was not the cold of the evening air. It was the feeling he had learned to trust above intelligence reports and counsel advice and every other tool available to him. Something in this house was wrong. And Ellie, in her damp slippers and her unraveling shawl, was standing in the middle of it without knowing it. He looked up at the second floor of the manor. One window, north-facing, dim. A figure standing at the glass with one hand pressed flat against it, looking down at the courtyard. He did not look away this time. Neither did she. The letter was gone by morning. Theron had searched the south corridor twice in the dark hours before dawn, moving through the sleeping house with the careful silence of a man who had learned stealth not as a skill, but as a necessity. He had found the writing desk easily enough, a heavy oak piece against the wall beside the window, ink-stained and cluttered with ledgers and rolled correspondence. He had gone through every paper on its surface and 2 of its 3 drawers without making a sound. The 3rd drawer was locked. He had knelt in front of it for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the iron keyhole, listening to the house breathe around him. Somewhere above, a floorboard shifted. A door opened and closed softly. Then silence again, thick and gray as the pre-dawn air coming through the gap under the corridor window. He had left the drawer locked and gone back to the stable loft where he was sleeping, climbing into the hay with his boots still on, and his mind moving fast and quiet through everything he had gathered in the past 24 hours. Prentice, the locked drawer, the letter addressed to someone waiting for news. We are still on course. The course toward what, exactly, was the question that kept him awake until the first pale light appeared in the loft's small eastern window. Ellie woke that morning to the sound of her cousin Sarah's voice in the hallway outside her room, bright and carrying, the way Sarah's voice always was when she wanted to be heard through walls. The King's advance party sent word. They arrive tomorrow, not in 4 days. Uncle is reorganizing everything this morning. Ellie sat up in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow. She had 4 days. She had been carefully not thinking about those 4 days, treating them as a kind of buffer between the life she currently inhabited and whatever came after. And now they were 1 day, 1 morning, 1 night's sleep between Ellie as she was and Ellie as she would have to become. She dressed quickly in the cold of her room, pulling on her warmest wool dress, dark blue and plain, and lacing her boots with fingers that were steadier than she felt. She braided her hair back from her face, tight and neat, because she needed at least one thing to be orderly this morning. She looked at herself briefly in the small mirror on the wall above the washstand. She looked, she thought, exactly like a woman trying to look like she was not afraid. She turned away from the mirror and went downstairs. The manor was already awake and moving with the particular frantic energy of a household rearranging itself under pressure. Marta was directing 2 kitchen girls in the reorganization of the larder. The steward was counting linens in the front hallway. Her uncle stood at the entrance to his study, speaking in low, rapid tones to Prentice, his broad hand gesturing as he talked. the ring on his finger catching the morning light. Ellie slowed as she passed the study doorway. She was not trying to listen. She simply passed more slowly than necessary, the way people do when something pulls at them without explanation. She caught only fragments through the half-open door. Her uncle's voice, tighter than usual. Needs to go smoothly. Nothing unexpected. Prentice, even and measured. Everything is in place. She won't cause any difficulty. Her uncle again, quieter. She doesn't know about Harwick? A pause. Prentice. No, and she won't, if we manage the timing correctly. Ellie walked on. She reached the kitchen and stood for a moment at the large stone hearth, her palms flat against its warm surface, feeling the heat work into her cold fingers. Her mind was moving carefully through what she had heard, the way she moved through the dark library, slowly, attentive to obstacles. Harwick. She knew that name. She had heard it once before, 2 years ago, in a conversation she was not supposed to have overheard, when her uncle had been speaking to a merchant from the western ports. Harwick was a man, or perhaps a place. She had always assumed the latter. Now she was not certain. You look like you're trying to heat yourself from the inside out. She turned. The servant, Cole, was standing at the kitchen door with a stack of firewood in his arms, snow melting on his shoulders and in his dark hair. He must have gone out at first light, she realized. The cold came off him in a wave. I'm thinking, she said, about the advance party. He moved past her to the wood box beside the hearth, setting the logs down with practiced quiet. She watched him. How did you know they'd moved the schedule? Stable boy told me this morning. He crouched in front of the wood box, arranging the logs, not looking at her. Word travels fast in a house this size. This was true. She let it pass. Are you staying for the arrival? A brief pause, almost imperceptible. Probably. Lord Vane must be very thorough, she said, echoing what she had heard him tell the steward the day before. He looked up at her then, and there it was again. That steadiness. That quality of attention that didn't fit the rough wool tunic and the patched cloak and the easy cover story. She held his gaze this time and watched him hold hers, and neither of them looked away, and the fire in the hearth shifted and sent a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Why did you move the woodpile yesterday? From the right side of the shed to the left? Something changed in his expression. Very slight, almost nothing. It was better stacked on the left, more protected from the wind. I've been stacking it on the right for 3 winters, she said. It's always been fine. The wind was coming from the east yesterday. He stood. It won't always come from the same direction. She looked at him for a long moment. He returned the look with the same unbothered steadiness, as though being examined was not something that concerned him. You're not from Lord Vane's household, she said. It was not quite an accusation. More a stone dropped into still water to see what moved. His expression did not change. What makes you say that? Lord Vane's household uses a burgundy seal on their correspondence. I've seen it enough times to know it. She paused. The letter in your coat pocket has a different seal. I noticed it yesterday when you set down the wood. Dark blue, I think, with a mark I didn't recognize. The kitchen was very quiet. Marta and the girls were in the larder. The steward had moved on. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls of the house with a low, persistent sound. Cole, or whoever he was, looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, You notice a great deal. I've had to, she said simply. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not alarm. Something closer to recognition, she thought. The expression of someone hearing an echo of their own experience in an unexpected place. I'm not here to harm you, he said. The plainness of it was startling. No deflection, no continued performance of the cover story, just the statement, direct and even. "That's not the same as telling me who you are," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She held his gaze for another moment, then turned back to the fire. "The advance party arrives tomorrow. Whatever you're doing here, you should be careful. Prentice notices things too." She looked at him over her shoulder. "And unlike me, I don't think he cares whether you're harmed or not." She left the kitchen before he could respond. Theron stood at the hearth for a long moment after she was gone, listening to the crackle of the fire and the wind against the walls, and the distant sounds of the household rearranging itself around the news of tomorrow's arrival. She had made him in less than 36 hours. Without resources, without authority, without anything except a pair of careful eyes and 3 winters of stacking wood in the same corner of the same shed. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket. "Dark blue seal," she had said, with a mark she didn't recognize. He had taken it from the corridor that morning before dawn, slipped from beneath the locked drawer's gap. Not the letter Prentice had been writing, but another one, older, folded small, and tucked into the back corner of a ledger that had been left on the desktop by accident, or so he chose to believe. He had not yet broken the seal. He broke it now, standing at the kitchen hearth with the fire warming his back and the house moving around him, and unfolded the paper with careful hands. It was short. 4 lines. "The arrangement with Stonefield proceeds as planned. The girl will be delivered to Harwick upon the signing of the false contract. Lord Cedric has agreed to the terms. He believes the king will simply find another candidate. He does not know that Harwick has other uses for her entirely." Theron read it twice. Then he folded it, placed it back inside his coat, and stood very still with his hands flat on the stone of the hearth, and the fire burning beside him, and the cold, absolute clarity of a man who now understood exactly what kind of danger he was standing inside. Ellie was not being offered to the Alpha King. She was being sold to someone else entirely. Someone named Harwick. Someone her uncle had made a different, darker agreement with behind the facade of the official contract. And the Alpha King's arrival tomorrow, his own arrival, the representatives, the arrangement, all of it was being used as cover, a distraction, a reason to get her ready, presentable, prepared for transport. He pushed off from the hearth. He needed to know who Harwick was. He needed to know the timeline. And he needed, above everything else, to decide in the next 12 hours exactly how much longer he was going to keep pretending to be someone named Cole. The advance party arrived before noon. There were 6 of them, riding in through the iron gate on dark horses with the Northern Territory's gray banner folded at their saddlebags, deliberately inconspicuous for an official delegation, which told Theron everything he needed to know about how seriously his own people took their instructions. He had sent word 3 weeks ago that the initial visit to Stonefield should be handled with restraint. No ceremony, no pageantry, just eyes and ears, and an honest report sent back to him. He watched them ride in from the shadow of the stable doorway, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. He recognized the man at the front immediately. Edric, his oldest advisor, and the closest thing he had to a friend, a broad man in his late 50s, with a white-streaked beard and the unhurried bearing of someone who had survived enough political storms to stop being impressed by any single one of them. Edric dismounted in the courtyard with the careful movements of a man whose knees had been complaining about long rides for the past decade, handed his reins to the stable boy, and stood looking around the manor grounds with the expression he always wore when assessing a new place. Mouth slightly pursed, eyes moving slowly, taking inventory. Theron stepped out of the stable doorway. Edric saw him immediately. His eyes moved from Theron's patched cloak to his rough tunic to his face, and the only sign of his reaction was a very slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the expression of a man who had seen his king do unexpected things before and had made peace with it years ago. He walked toward him at a normal pace, stopping beside the woodpile, close enough to speak quietly. "My lord," he said, just above a whisper. I won't ask. Good, Theron said. I need you to listen. He told him in 4 minutes, speaking low and fast, his eyes moving across the courtyard as he talked. The letter, Harwick. The false contract. Lord Cedric's arrangement. Prentice and the locked drawer and the timeline he still hadn't confirmed but suspected was tied to the signing ceremony, whatever form that would take. Edric listened without interrupting, his eyes on the middle distance, his face giving nothing away. When Theron finished, there was a brief silence. Harwick, Edric said quietly. Ren Harwick, merchant lord out of the western coast, operates in about 6 different kinds of legal gray, has properties in the interior that nobody official has ever successfully inspected. He paused. There have been rumors about those properties, about the kind of people who go in and don't come out the same way they went in. Something cold moved through Theron's chest. How long have there been rumors? Long enough that I should have brought you a formal report before now, Edric said. There was something in his voice that was not quite guilt, but lived near it. The evidence was never solid enough to act on. He's careful. He's careful, Theron repeated very quietly. Yes. Theron looked across the courtyard at the manor's back door. Closed this morning, no damp slippers on the frost, no basket of linen, just gray stone and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of the household inside moving through its preparations for an arrival that was never meant to be what it appeared. She doesn't know any of it, he said. The girl? Her name is Ellie. He said it without deciding to. And no, she thinks this is a political arrangement. She thinks she's been put forward as a candidate for a marriage contract. She's been preparing herself for a life she didn't choose, and the man who was supposed to protect her has been selling her to someone else entirely behind the face of that preparation. Edric was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? I need someone watching Prentice from the moment you go inside that house. I need to know if any correspondence leaves Stonefield today. I need the locked drawer in the south corridor opened without anyone knowing it's been opened. He paused. And I need you to play your role today. Official visit, standard assessment, nothing unusual. Lord Cedric cannot know anything has changed. And you? Theron looked at the manor door again. I'm going to talk to her. Ellie was in the library when she heard the horses arrive. She had spent the morning there intentionally, staying clear of the controlled chaos of the household's preparations, the relining of the guest rooms, the polishing of silverware that had not been polished in years, the particular anxious energy of people trying to make a house look like something it was not. She had braided her hair twice, changed her dress once, and then deliberately put the blue dress back and returned to the gray one because she was tired of performing, and the performance hadn't even started yet. She heard the hoofbeats in the courtyard below and did not go to the window. She picked up her book instead. She had read the same page 4 times when the library door opened. She looked up expecting Syrah, or possibly her uncle summoning her downstairs to be presented. She did not expect the man in the patched cloak who stepped through the door and closed it behind him with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had checked the corridor before entering. She set the book down. You shouldn't be up here, she said. No, he agreed, remaining by the door. But I need to speak with you, and I needed to do it somewhere Prentice isn't. Something in the way he said the name, flat and careful, made her sit up straighter. Why? He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something she had not seen in his face before. Not the steadiness, which was still there. Something beneath it. A decision being made in real time. The expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and is choosing, right now, to set it down. My name is not Cole, he said. The room was very still. Outside, she could hear the faint sounds of the courtyard below, voices and boots on stone, the arrival settling into the house. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know." "I've known since yesterday." She folded her hands in her lap, her voice even. "You moved my woodpile. You noticed the wind direction. You held my gaze like a man who has never had to lower it for anyone. You don't walk like a servant. You don't stand like a servant. And when Prentice spoke to you yesterday evening in the yard, you looked at him the way a man looks at something he's already categorized as a threat." She paused. "I don't know who you are, but I know what you aren't." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Deeper than that. "My name is Theron," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone into deep water, and the silence that followed it was the silence of someone feeling the ripples reach them and understanding, suddenly, how far down the water went. Ellie did not move. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet. "You came here yourself," she said, not a question. "Yes." "Dressed as a servant." "Yes." "To see me." A pause. "Before the contract." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The drizzle had returned outside, tapping softly against the north-facing window. The smell of old leather and dust hung in the still air of the room. Somewhere below, her uncle's voice rose briefly, and then subsided. "What did you hear?" she asked. "In the courtyard. The morning you arrived." He did not look away. "Enough." "Enough to what?" "Enough to understand," he said, "that whatever you've been told about why you're here and what this arrangement is meant to be, there are people in this house who have been telling you a different story than the one they're telling each other." The cold that moved through her then was not the cold of the room. "Harwick," she said. The word came out very quietly. His expression shifted. "Where did you hear that name?" "My uncle, this morning. He was speaking to Prentice, and I was passing, and I wasn't meant to hear." She watched his face carefully. "What is it? Who is he?" Theron crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and she understood in that moment that it was a deliberate choice, not to loom over her, not to use the height and the presence and the weight of what he was, but to speak to her face to face, as an equal. "I'm going to tell you the truth," he said, "all of it, and it's going to be difficult to hear. But I need you to hear it clearly, because what happens in the next 24 hours depends on you understanding exactly what kind of danger you're standing in." Ellie looked at him. This man who had arrived in borrowed clothes and a false name, and moved her woodpile to the sheltered side of the shed, and felt, beneath the cold and the fear beginning to form at the edges of her awareness, something she had not expected. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone was actually speaking to her. Not at her. Not around her. Not about her in rooms she was not supposed to be in. To her. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything. The letter, Harwick's name and what Edric had told him about the Western properties and the rumors that clung to them. The false contract layered beneath the real one. Her uncle's debts and the agreement he had made and the thing Ellie was in it. Not a candidate, not a bride, but a transaction, wrapped in the language of alliance to keep her cooperative and unaware until the moment cooperation was no longer necessary. She listened without interrupting. Her face stayed still in that way he had come to recognize, the practiced stillness, but he could see what it was costing her this time. He could see it in the set of her jaw, and the way her hands, still folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles again. When he finished, the room was very quiet. "My uncle agreed to this," she said at last. Not a question either. "Yes." A long silence. "How much?" Her voice was steady. He understood what she was asking. Enough to clear his debts and keep Stonefield standing for another decade. She nodded once, a small, precise movement, and looked at the window. The drizzle ran down the glass in thin, slow lines. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. He had expected tears or anger, or the particular frozen stillness of someone too overwhelmed to respond. He had not expected that. The directness of it. The immediate movement from grief toward action. The instinct of someone who had long ago learned that falling apart was a luxury the situation rarely allowed. He looked at her in the gray library light and felt something settle in his chest, quiet and certain, the way a compass needle settles when it finds its direction. "Tonight," he said, "I need you to do nothing differently. Dinner with the family, polite and composed, exactly as they expect you to be. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Tomorrow morning, Prentice will give you instructions about the signing ceremony. Follow them. Don't let him know anything has changed." She held his gaze. "And you?" "Prentice will have sent word to Harwick by now that the timeline is confirmed. I need to find that correspondence before it leaves the manor grounds. Once I have it, I have everything I need to move against him legally and permanently." He paused. "But I need one more night inside this house to do it." She was quiet for a moment. "The library," she said. "No one comes here. There's a door at the back behind the far shelf that leads to the east servants' stair. It's the only stair in the house Prentice doesn't use." She held his gaze. "You can work from here tonight without anyone knowing." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who had just been told the ground beneath her had been hollow all along, and had decided, without hesitation, to keep standing on it. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shook her head, very slightly. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when it's over." The house settled into its evening quiet slowly, like a man lowering himself into cold water, careful and reluctant. Ellie sat through dinner with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her expression arranged into the composed, cooperative blankness her cousins had always mistaken for emptiness. Sarah talked at length about the Northern Territories, things she had read or imagined or embellished, her voice bright and performative in the way it always was when there were guests worth impressing. Her uncle sat at the head of the table and directed conversation with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years managing appearances, and Prentice sat at his right hand and said almost nothing and watched everything, his pale eyes moving from face to face with the quiet patience of someone who was always counting. Ellie ate her bread and her thin soup and answered when she was spoken to, and gave them absolutely nothing to read. Two of Theron's advance party sat at the table as well, formal and pleasant, playing their roles with the same discipline she was playing hers. She did not look for Theron among the household staff moving through the room. She already knew he was not there. She had left the library door unlatched before coming down. After dinner, her uncle summoned her to his study, and she went without hesitation, her hands still, her breathing even. He stood at the fireplace with his back to her when she entered, his hands clasped behind him, the fire throwing his shadow long across the stone floor. He was a tall man, thin in the way of someone who had once been broader and had diminished without entirely noticing it. His hair had gone mostly gray in the past 2 years. She had thought, when she was younger, that he was simply a serious man, the kind of seriousness that came from responsibility and loss. She understood now that it was not seriousness. It was the particular weight of a man who had made choices he could not unmake, and was living in their shadow. "Tomorrow will go smoothly," he said, without turning. "Prentice will walk you through the ceremony in the morning. It's a simple signing, nothing elaborate. You'll be asked to confirm your willingness for the record. Standard language." "I understand," she said. He turned then, and looked at her, and something passed across his face that she might have called regret if she had trusted it. "You've always been a sensible girl, Ellie," he said. "This is the right path. for the family, for the estate. She looked at him across the firelit room and thought about the letter. About Harwick. About the words she won't cause any difficulty spoken in this man's corridor about her life. "Of course, Uncle," she said. She went to bed and did not sleep. Theron worked through the night. The library was cold and dark, except for the single candle Ellie had left on the table beside the chair, its flame burning small and steady in the still air. He moved through the papers from the locked drawer, which Edric had opened cleanly before dinner, and resealed with the same wax and a matching stamp from the manor's own supply, a detail that had required 20 minutes and considerable ingenuity, and which Theron had noted with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man surrounded by competent people. What he found in the drawer was more complete than he had hoped. The full agreement between Lord Cedric and Wren Harwick, 3 pages of careful, lawyerly language that said, in its essence, that Ellie would be presented to the AlphaKing's representatives as a marriage candidate, and that when the official contract failed to reach a conclusion, as it was intended to fail, she would be transferred quietly to Harwick's custody, under the pretense of a private arrangement. Her uncle would receive payment in 2 installments. The second installment was contingent on delivery. The word sat on the page in plain ink. Delivery. Theron set the paper down on the library table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a long moment and breathed. Then he picked up the page again and kept working. By the time the candle had burned to half its height, he had everything documented, catalogued, and witnessed by Edric, who had slipped up the servant's stair at midnight and read the papers in silence, with the expression of a man whose worst suspicions had been confirmed and found no satisfaction in it. They spoke in low voices for 20 minutes. Edric returned downstairs. Theron remained at the table and wrote 2 letters of his own, pressing his own seal into the wax with the ring he wore on his right hand always. The one he had not removed even in the servant's costume, because some things were too deep to take off. The first letter was to his chief magistrate in the Northern Territories. The second was to the Port Authority of the Western Coast, with instructions that were specific and unambiguous, and which would, by the end of the week, make Wren Harwick's carefully maintained operations considerably more visible to considerably more official eyes than had ever looked at them before. He sat back in the library chair and listened to the house around him. The fire had gone out in the hearth downstairs. The wind had died. The drizzle had stopped sometime after midnight and left the world outside the window clean and black and very still. He thought about Ellie in her room above him. Awake, he was almost certain, lying in her narrow bed in the dark and turning over the shape of everything she had learned yesterday in this same room. He thought about what came next. She heard his step on the servant's stair just before dawn. She was sitting in the chair by her bedroom window with a wool blanket over her shoulders and her boots on, her braid slightly unraveled, a cup of cold tea on the sill beside her that she had made 2 hours ago and forgotten to drink. The sky outside was the deep blue-gray of the last hour before light, and the pine trees at the edge of the grounds were black shapes against it, motionless. A soft knock at her door. She opened it without hesitation. He looked the same as he had every morning, the rough tunic and the patched cloak, but something had shifted in the set of his shoulders and the way he held himself, a loosening of whatever deliberate restraint had kept him contained inside the roll of coal for the past 2 days. He was simply himself now, she thought, whatever that meant, in borrowed clothes in a borrowed house in the last dark hour before everything changed. "It's done," he said quietly. She stepped back to let him into the room. He entered and stood near the window, looking out at the dark pine trees, and she stood near the door and looked at him. "Prentice?" she asked. "Edric has him in the east sitting room. He found the outgoing correspondence last night. A writer was meant to leave at first light for Harwick's estate, confirming the timeline." He paused. "The writer didn't leave. And my uncle?" A silence. "He'll be given a choice," Theron said. He turned from the window and looked at her directly, and his voice was careful and even, the voice of a man giving difficult news to someone he respected too much to soften it past recognition. He cooperated fully with an attempt to deceive the crown and deliver a subject of this kingdom into private custody under false pretenses. That is not a small thing. It cannot be simply set aside. I know, she said. He will face a formal inquiry. The estate's debts will be restructured under crown oversight rather than extinguished. Stonefield will survive. He held her gaze. He will survive, but there will be consequences. Ellie looked at him across the small, cold room. This man who had arrived 3 days ago in the dark with a false name and a borrowed coat, and she thought about her uncle at his fireplace saying, "You've always been a sensible girl," in the voice of a man saying goodbye to something he had already sold. She thought about Prentice in the corridor, about the letter and its clean, cold language. Delivery. She thought about what she felt, and found that it was not the devastation she had expected. It was something older and quieter. The particular grief of a thing you had already half known, finally confirmed. "All right," she said. He watched her. "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think I will be." Something in his expression shifted, warm and very brief, like light moving across stone. "There is one more thing," he said, "and this one I'm asking, not telling." She waited. "The contract," he said. "The real one, not Harwick's version. The actual arrangement that was proposed between Stonefield and the Northern Territories." He paused, and for the first time since she had known him, even briefly, she saw something in his face that was not composure or steadiness, or the quiet authority of a man accustomed to certainty. She saw something uncertain, human and careful and slightly afraid of the answer. "I would like to discuss it. With you. Not through intermediaries or signed papers or portraits sent through the post. With you, directly, as two people who have spent 3 days being more honest with each other than either of us probably planned." The sky outside the window was beginning to lighten, very slowly, at the eastern edge. The pine trees were separating from the darkness, their shapes growing distinct. Ellie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the courtyard and the porridge and the woodpile moved to the sheltered side of the shed. She thought about a man who had crouched in front of her chair to speak at her eye level when he did not have to. She thought about the word delivery on a page and the word sensible from a fireplace and the long, careful years of taking up as little space as possible and being seen through and around and never quite at. She thought about what it had felt like in this library yesterday afternoon, to be spoken to directly. "I'm listening," she said. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at Stonefield Manor spread through the Northern Territories in the way that true stories spread, slowly at first and then all at once, accumulating detail and losing it in equal measure until the shape that remained was something simpler and more enduring than the complicated truth. What people said was this: the Alpha King had gone north in secret, and what he had found there had changed something in him. What he had done about it had changed something in the territory. Ren Harwick's western properties were inspected formally within the fortnight by a crown delegation that arrived with the kind of documentation that left no room for the usual gray areas. What they found there resulted in proceedings that occupied the magistrate's court for the better part of a year and ended with outcomes that were, for once, as complete as such things could be. The people who had needed finding were found. The man who had built the operation and maintained it and called it by careful legal names was not able to call it anything for much longer. Lord Cedric of Stonefield faced his inquiry in the early spring, in a chamber in the northern capital, with a crown-appointed advocate at his side, and the full weight of what he had agreed to laid plainly before him. He did not contest the facts. He was a precise man, and the facts were precise, and contesting them would have been a kind of dishonesty he found at the end that he could not sustain. The estate was restructured. His debts were absorbed into a repayment arrangement that would take years and require him to manage Stonefield with a frugality he had long avoided. He returned home to a house that was still standing and found, to his own complicated surprise, that he was grateful for it. Prentice left the territory entirely. Where he went, no one at Stonefield was particularly motivated to discover. Sarah married a merchant's son from the southern counties the following autumn and moved away from Stonefield with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had always treated the place as temporary. Her sister followed 2 years later. The manor grew quieter, and in its quietness, steadier. Marta the cook remained. She always remained. Ellie was married in the late summer, in the northern capital, in a ceremony that was smaller than tradition required, and exactly the size she had asked for. She wore a dress the color of deep water, not blue exactly, something between blue and gray, the color of the sky above Stonefield on a clear winter morning. She had chosen it herself. She had chosen most things herself, in the months between the library and the ceremony, in the slow, deliberate process of learning what it felt like to be asked. Theron stood at the front of the hall and watched her walk toward him, and felt the same thing he had felt in a cold kitchen courtyard, with a log in each hand, that unnamed shifting in his chest, except that it had a name now, had acquired one gradually over months of conversation and disagreement, and the occasional silence that was comfortable rather than careful. After the ceremony, in the long light of the summer evening, they walked together in the gardens of the northern capital with the smell of pine and warm stone around them, and she told him about the first time she had known he wasn't who he said he was, not the woodpile, earlier than that. "The way you looked at the manor gate when you arrived," she said. "You looked at it the way you look at something you're deciding about. Not arriving at. Deciding about." She glanced at him. "Men who work for other men don't look at gates that way." He was quiet for a moment. "And you said nothing." "I wanted to see what you would do," she said simply. He looked at her. This woman who had spent years being invisible in a house that did not deserve her, and had emerged from it not diminished but precise, knowing exactly what she was, and what she was not, and what she would and would not accept. "And?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything, looking out across the evening garden with the last of the summer light warm on her face. "You moved the woodpile," she said, "to the sheltered side." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I think you'll do." The sun finished setting over the northern pines, and the stars came out one by one above the capital, and inside the hall behind them, the celebration continued without them for a while, which was exactly as they had planned it. The AlphaKing had gone north in borrowed clothes to look at a woman he had never met. He'd come home with something he had not known he was missing. And Ellie, who had spent 23 years learning to take up as little space as possible, finally, quietly, took up all of hers.